October 14th, 2023. 5:47 am Central Time. Minneapolis, Minnesota. The sun has not yet risen over the Cedar Riverside neighborhood. The streets are quiet. The halal grocery on the corner is dark. The community center parking lot sits empty beneath a single flickering sodium vapor light. Inside a gray, unmarked panel van parked 3 blocks east on Riverside Avenue, a team of federal agents runs through final communications checks. This is supposed to be routine. A coordinated inspection of a Somali American nonprofit organization operating out of a converted 2-story brick office building on the 1900 block of South 4th Street. The organization, which we will call Bridges of Hope Community Services, has been flagged for irregularities in its refugee resettlement paperwork. Missing signatures. Duplicated case numbers. A standard compliance audit escalated to a federal referral after a caseworker at the Minnesota Department of Human Services noticed something she couldn't explain. 17 unaccompanied minors, all between the ages of 6 and 14, assigned to sponsor families that did not appear to exist. 17 children. 17 addresses that led to vacant apartments, condemned buildings, and in one case, an empty lot on the north side of St. Paul. The agents expect to find sloppy bookkeeping, maybe fraud, maybe a scheme to siphon federal resettlement grants through fabricated case files. They do not expect what they are about to find. At 6:02 a.m., the breach team moves on the front and rear entrances simultaneously. 12 agents from the FBI's Minneapolis field office. 8 officers from ICE Homeland Security Investigations. 4 forensic analysts. 2 translators fluent in Somali and Arabic. The warrants are federal, signed by a magistrate judge in the District of Minnesota, authorizing seizure of all financial records, electronic devices, case files, and communications related to the resettlement activities of Bridges of Hope Community Services dating back to January 2019. The front door gives way without resistance. The building is unlocked. The lights inside are already on. What the lead agents find on the second floor stops the operation cold. Not file cabinets filled with refugee paperwork. Not a cluttered nonprofit office running on donated furniture and good intentions. Instead, a commercial-grade server room behind a false wall in what should have been a storage closet. 11 desktop computers, all powered on, all connected to encrypted communication platforms. A room lined floor to ceiling with filing cabinets, not the kind you find at Goodwill, but heavy-gauge steel, fireproof, fitted with combination locks, and inside those cabinets, organized with chilling precision, the case files of more than 200 children. Not resettlement files. Transit files. Each folder contains a photograph, a forged birth certificate, fabricated medical records, a falsified I-94 arrival document, and a routing sheet. The routing sheets use a coded system, color-coded tabs, numbered way stations, that traces a path from the Horn of Africa through intermediary countries, into the United States via multiple ports of entry, and then outward to final destinations in 7 states. Minnesota, Ohio, Texas, Virginia, Georgia, Tennessee, Washington. The children in these files are not refugees being resettled. They are commodities being moved. The investigation that follows will consume 14 months, involve 44 federal agents across 6 field offices, and expose what prosecutors will later describe as one of the most sophisticated child trafficking networks ever operated under the cover of a federally funded nonprofit organization on American soil. At the center of it all stands one man. His name, for the purposes of this account, is Abdi Mukhtar Elmi. 53 years old. A naturalized U.S. citizen since 2004. A respected figure in the Cedar Riverside community. He has been photographed shaking hands with 2 Minneapolis mayors. He has testified before the Minnesota State Legislature on refugee integration. He has received commendations from 3 separate federal agencies for his work in community outreach. His face has appeared in the Minneapolis Star Tribune no fewer than 11 times, always smiling, always standing beside grateful families he claims to have helped start new lives. Abdi Mukhtar Elmi is not a community leader. He is, according to the 67-page federal indictment unsealed in December 2024, the operational architect of a transnational child smuggling enterprise that exploited every vulnerability in the American refugee resettlement system for nearly 5 years. The scope of the network becomes clear in stages, each revelation worse than the last. Stage 1. The money. Forensic accountants embedded with the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit begin tracing the flow of funds through Bridges of Hope. The nonprofit received $4.2 million in federal resettlement grants between 2019 and 2023. It received an additional $1.8 million in state funding from the Minnesota Department of Human Services. On paper, these funds supported housing placement, language instruction, medical referrals, and cultural orientation for newly arrived refugees. In reality, more than 60% of these funds were diverted. Shell companies registered in Delaware and Wyoming received wire transfers from the nonprofit's operating accounts. Those shell companies then paid invoices for services never rendered, consulting fees, transportation contracts, facility leases, cycling the money through 3 layers of intermediary accounts before it landed in overseas accounts in Djibouti, Kenya, and the United Arab Emirates. The money flowing outward funded the supply chain. Recruiters in Mogadishu, Hargeisa, and the Dadaab refugee complex in northeastern Kenya identified children, orphans, children separated from families by conflict, children whose parents were dead or displaced beyond contact. These recruiters were paid between $800 and $2500 per child, depending on age and documentation difficulty. Stage 2. The documents. A forger operating out of Nairobi, identified in the indictment only by the alias Sahal, produced the paperwork that transformed smuggled children into legitimate refugee cases. Birth certificates. Vaccination records. UNCUR referral documents. Each package cost between $3,000 and $5,000 and was virtually indistinguishable from authentic documentation. Federal agents later determined that at least 47 of these forged packages passed through official U.S. refugee screening processes without being flagged. 47 children entered the United States with identities that did not belong to them, assigned to sponsor families that were fictional constructs, processed through a system that trusted the very organization exploiting it. Stage 3. The distribution. Once inside the United States, the children were moved. Some were placed with families who had paid fees, ranging from $10,000 to $35,000, for what was euphemistically described in coded communications as family completion services. Some were funneled into labor exploitation, placed in businesses owned by network associates. Federal investigators identified at least 3 restaurants in Columbus, Ohio, and 2 warehouses in the Dallas-Fort Worth metropolitan area, where minors were found working under conditions that met the federal definition of forced labor. And some children simply vanished from the paper trail entirely. Their routing sheets end with a red tab and no final destination listed. Investigators have not yet accounted for all of them. The coordinated takedown comes on the morning of December 12, 2024. Simultaneous arrest operations in Minneapolis, Columbus, Nashville, Dallas, and the Northern Virginia suburbs. 44 agents execute 14 arrest warrants before 7:00 am Eastern. Abdi Mukhtar Elmi is taken into custody at his home in the Whittier neighborhood of Minneapolis. He does not resist. He asks to call his lawyer. He says nothing else. Alongside Elmi, 13 co-conspirators are arrested. Among them, a former caseworker at the Minnesota Department of Human Services who provided insider access to the resettlement database. A licensed immigration attorney in Virginia who filed fraudulent sponsorship paperwork on behalf of fictitious families. 2 logistics coordinators who managed the domestic movement of children between states using a fleet of vehicles registered to yet another shell company. The indictment lists 31 counts. Conspiracy to commit human trafficking, trafficking of minors, wire fraud, money laundering, document fraud, conspiracy to defraud the United States. Each count carries sentencing ranges that stack. Elmi alone faces a statutory maximum of over 400 years in federal prison. At the press conference following the arrests, the U.S. Attorney for the District of Minnesota stands at a podium flanked by representatives from the FBI, ICE, and the Department of Health and Human Services Office of Inspector General. This defendant exploited the most vulnerable human beings on earth, children without parents, without advocates, without anyone to speak for them, and he did it while wearing the mask of a humanitarian, she states. He weaponized the trust that our refugee system depends on. He turned compassion into a supply chain. The FBI's special agent in charge adds a single sentence that lands like a verdict of its own. Every handshake, every award, every photograph was part of the cover. In the months following the arrests, the full human cost begins to surface. Victim impact assessments conducted by HSI's Specialized Child Exploitation Unit identify 89 children directly affected by the network's operations. Of those, 61 have been located and are now in the care of legitimate child welfare agencies. 28 remain unaccounted for. Caseworkers describe children who do not know their real names, children who were told their parents sent them to America for a better life, children who arrived in homes where they were treated not as family members but as property. One 14-year-old girl, recovered from a residence in suburban Nashville, tells investigators through a translator that she was told she was going to school. She had not attended a single day of school in the 3 years since she arrived in the United States. A 9-year-old boy found working in the back kitchen of a restaurant in Columbus has burn scars on both forearms. He does not speak. The psychologist assigned to his case reports that he has not spoken a single word in any language since being removed from the premises. These are not statistics. These are children. The systemic failures exposed by the investigation are staggering in their simplicity. Federal resettlement grants were dispersed with minimal post-placement auditing. Sponsor family verifications relied on documentation provided by the very organizations under review. Database cross-referencing between federal agencies was inconsistent, delayed, and in some cases non-existent. A single caseworker at a state agency, one person, doing her job, checking addresses that didn't add up, triggered the entire investigation. Without her diligence, the network might still be operating today. Congressional inquiries have since been opened. The Department of Health and Human Services has announced a comprehensive review of its unaccompanied refugee minors program. New verification protocols are being drafted. Interagency data sharing agreements are being renegotiated. But protocols on paper do not find the 28 children who are still missing. As of late 2024, Abdi Mukhtar Elmi remains in federal custody awaiting trial. He has pleaded not guilty to all 31 counts. His defense attorney has filed motions to suppress evidence seized during the initial search, arguing the warrant was overbroad. Federal prosecutors have responded with a filing that runs to over 300 pages, supported by financial records, encrypted communications decrypted by FBI cyber specialists, testimony from cooperating witnesses, and the physical evidence recovered from that second-floor office on South 4th Street. The filing cabinets, the routing sheets, the photographs of children who trusted that someone, somewhere, was looking out for them. The trial is expected to begin in mid-2025. Legal analysts anticipate it will be one of the most significant human trafficking prosecutions in federal court in a decade. And somewhere tonight, in 7 states across this country, there are children whose real names no one knows. Children who were moved through a system designed to protect them by a man who was celebrated for protecting them. Children who became invisible the moment they were profitable. This is not a story that ends with the arrests. The arrests are only where the accounting begins. The question now is whether the systems that failed these children will be rebuilt strongly enough to prevent the next Abdi Mukhtar Elmi, because the next one is already watching to see if anyone is paying attention. Consider that carefully. Then ask yourself who is watching in your community, and whether anyone is checking the addresses.